Welcome back to another helpful guide. Today, we'll be learning about lighting and shading a variety of objects, textures, and forms. As always, all this fantastic information and still photos so that you can take your sweet time soaking it all up is in my article linked below. Check it out. Now, let's get started. The basics. Let's go over some fundamentals so that we can get a better idea of how it all works. Ambient lighting. This is the light that's preventing your scene from being totally dark. Take a look at our little town here. It's a bit dark without introducing a dominant light source, but we can still see everything, which means it's lit. Light source. As our sun comes up on the right of our town, we introduce a dominant light source. The shadows become more prominent and a direction to the lighting is made apparent. Highlights. Notice how, as our sun moves across our town in an arc from right to left, the brightest points on our buildings move along with it. These are our highlights, the lightest spot and often the highest and closest points to our light source. Cast shadows. The dark points being cast by our objects, oftentimes on the ground, are what we refer to as cast shadows. It's darker closer to our buildings and gets lighter the further the shadow stretches away. Notice how the length of the cast shadow changes based on where the light source is situated and how close it is to our subject. Reflective light. Reflective light occurs when your light source bounces off of objects and hits your subject. It adapts the hue of the surrounding objects that it's bouncing off of rather than the hue of your light source. To show what I mentioned earlier of this reflective light taking on the color of its surroundings, we'll review a white sphere set against a green backdrop. Despite our light source flashlight being a cool blue hue, the lower shadows adapt the surrounding color of green as light reflects back onto the sphere from the ground. When it comes to reflective surfaces and lighting, it may be surprising to realize the algorithms that go into their creation in real life. Yes, there's mathematics behind realistic art, and that's because there's mathematics behind life in general. Let's take a quick look at the basics of some of these principles. Law of reflection. Merriam-Webster describes this as a statement in optics. When light falls upon a plane surface, it is so reflected that the angle of reflection is equal to the angle of incidence, and that the incident ray, reflected ray, and normal ray all lie in the plane of incidence. Now, that's a bit confusing, so let's break things down so it's easier to understand. Incident ray. What we call the incident ray, or eye, in our following diagrams, is our light source that comes down and hits our mirror or reflective surface. Reflective ray. A reflective ray, or R, in our following diagrams, is the light that's being reflected back from our incident ray. Normal ray, or N, in our following diagrams, this is the line perpendicular to our reflective surface, found at 90 degrees. So, what's the law of reflection for dummies? In essence, it means that when our incident ray hits our surface, the reflective ray will have an equal angle to the incident ray. In other words, I equals R in plane angle. This law doesn't just apply to a horizontal mirror and a uniform angle incident ray though. It can take effect with a mirror at any position and with an incident ray coming in at any angle. Theta I equals theta R, always. So, we know what the law of reflection is. Cool. Now let's explore that further with two kinds of reflection using the same principles. Specular reflection. Seen when the light is applied to smooth surfaces, such as mirrors and calm bodies of water. It results in a more uniform reflection that's easier to calculate the trajectory of. This exact trajectory for the light rays creates an image on the totally smooth surface that the light is bouncing off of. That's right, it's a mirror. Diffuse reflection. Seen when light is applied to uneven surfaces such as asphalt and canvas. If you're a photographer, you may recognize the term diffuser with the panels you put in front of your lights to provide more widespread lighting of your scene. This works because that layer of film, canvas, plastic, etc. provides a method for the incident rays to bounce off and scatter irregularly. Since your rays are going in all directions, you get a scene that's wider lit and a light source that's larger. In this same sense, clouds act as the diffusers for the sun. Without clouds in the sky, the sun will provide hard lighting due to its distance from your subject and small point. With clouds, the light gets thrown around and diffused, giving a larger and closer light source, forming softer shadows. So what's the TLDR of that? Soft light can be achieved by having a large light source or bringing your lighting closer to your subject. Hard light can be achieved by having a small light source or bringing your lighting farther from your subject. But don't just take my word for it. What's the point of a tutorial then? Let's see it in person. Hue shifts. When it comes to coloring and shading, it's important to use hue shifting to get a diversity of colors in your subject. This is done by occasionally shifting your color wheel's hue as you paint and shade. In this example of a sphere, we have on the left an image of hue shifting having been applied, while on the right, I used only a singular shade of red for the entirety of the sphere. The alternation of colors on the left sphere adds vibrancy and interest to the object, while the right sphere with its singular shade appears dull and boring. Notice that on the left sphere, I also added reflective green lighting to better incorporate it into the green backdrop. Grayscale values to color. Using the grayscale method of shading, in which you establish your scene's lighting and shadows in monochrome, before later adding color on top with blending modes, is a great way to ensure your artwork has contrast and visual interest. Before using this type of shading, however, it's important to understand how colors translate into grayscale values. Above is a chart of what percentage of gray corresponds to specific color shades. Notice how different colors also behave in different ways according to the gray values. While a 75% gray value equates to a bright cherry red, that same percentage of gray results in a dirty yellow. This is important to keep in mind while you employ monochrome painting to prevent the difficulty of getting proper colors later on. I suggest having a pre-established color palette in advance before utilizing the monochrome painting method, so that you can pre-check the shades correlating to gray values. Step 1. Create a new layer. Then, make a black circle using the Figure U tool with the ellipse setting on Line Fill. Create Fill. Next, drag the circle on your canvas while holding the Shift key to obtain a perfect circle. This will be the base for our sphere. Step 2. While observing our photo in monochrome, we mark in the general placement of the lights, darks, and midtones. Notice how these are comprised of circular and rounded shapes, as the curvature of the sphere wraps the light around it. Step 3. Use a bright shade of gray. The light source and rim light on the top and reflective light on the bottom are added in with this. Tip: I use the Figure U curve tool for adding the reflective light and rim light while locking my sphere layer to achieve that perfect curve. Step 4. Using Clip Studio's built-in blur tool found under the Blend J, I lock my sphere layer and smooth everything out. Step 5. To add extra emphasis to the rim light and correct any erasing that occurred during the blurring, I go in and add my rim light again before smoothing it out very carefully. I also add additional lighting reflections on the right of the sphere. Step 6. Form a highlight using white or near white for the brightest reflection of light. Some more shadows are also created in the sphere to darken it in replication of the source photo. I then emphasize the bottom reflective light compared to the photo to give our subject more contrast from its cast shadows that are also added. Tip: the cast shadows are added in their own layer below the sphere. Notice how the cast shadows also feature blurring, as a result of a light source that's close to the subject and or larger. Step 7. Time for coloring! On a new layer filled with a teal hue, set the blending mode to color. This will turn our entire scene that color. Step 8. Select only your sphere layer by Ctrl plus clicking the layer. With a soft eraser, gently erase the top portion of the color blending mode layer from the sphere. This is a result of the main light source being a different color from the reflective light bouncing off of the green floor, resulting in a reflective green lighting appearing on the bottom of the sphere and a main white gold lighting appearing on the top. Step 9. With your sphere still selected, add in some warm golden hues to the top of your sphere on your color blending mode layer. Additionally, dab some different blue hues to the lower, reflective lit portion of the sphere for a more dynamic work. Step 10. Grab the snow brush and on a new layer make speckles on the sphere's surface, just like our photo has. This is great for texturing our work. If your speckles are too small or tough to see, go to Layer Property, Effect, Border Effect, Watercolor Edge to make them stand out. Step 11. Almost done! As the last step, let's make this artwork pop by applying a tone curve. Plutchik Wheel of Emotions. This topic could be its own tutorial entirely, so we'll just touch on it briefly today and come back to it another time later. If you're stumped as to how to improve your scene further, consider using the Plutchik Wheel of Emotions to aid you in your color theory. Different colors evoke different emotions. By mastering what each color means, you can influence the mood of your work and allow more in-depth symbolism. Want to craft a dark and moody scene of a character who's lost a loved one? Use shades of dark blue to convey grief. Or maybe you wish for a violent artwork of a character who's lashing out in anger. If so, go for a red shading and lighting to get the point across. Painting realistic fur. Shading textures can be tricky due to their complex forms and larger degree of detail needed to convey realism. We'll be covering how to shade and paint fur, as it's a great way to improve one's understanding of lighting on intricate surfaces. First, we'll start by studying some reference photos I took. Fur ranges greatly in length, consistency, and color depending on what species the fur belongs to. The above references are of raccoon fur, which has a unique blend of coarse long fur and soft shorter fur. The brush, mainline watercolor thick coating, is what I use for the majority of these fur tutorials. I adjust the settings of it to alter the amount of paint, density of paint, hardness, and brush density for a different thickness and softness of strokes. Notice how just adjusting the fur hardness and size can create drastically different fur strokes. We'll be employing this method to create a variety of fur in our painting. Step 1. Begin by painting a rough base for your fur. No need to make it too detailed at this stage. Something loose and quick works just fine. Step 2. With a lighter color, block in the general positioning of highlights by using vertical strokes with a large brush size. Step 3. Blend the two shades subtly. Step 4. Lower the brightness of your fur to allow for easier highlighting later, and going to Edit, Tonal Correction, Brightness/Contrast. This will make the fur we'll be adding in at later steps appear more vibrant. Step 5. Perform additional blending of the fur and begin layering in the individual fur strands starting from the bottom of the subject and working your way up. The ends of the fur strands will be lighter, while the bases will be darker as shadows fall upon them. Tip: starting at the bottom and working your way up prevents you from coloring over your strokes as you go. Step 6. I continue adding fur details and strands, gradually increasing the hardness of my brush to make strands that are closer to the viewer appear more crisp. This alternation of hardness gives an effect similar to adjusting the aperture on a camera and helps form a shallow depth of field. Step 7. More highlighting strands are added delicately to areas of the fur which are too dark and need more diversity. Take care to not place your fur randomly and to instead give it structured appearance, as seen in our photo example. Step 8. With the hardness set to maximum or near maximum, I add in the final thin strands of a new layer for pronounced texture. These are placed most commonly in highlighted regions. Step 9. Blend in the bases of the newly added crisp fur strands. Step 10. If your fur is lacking contrast, consider making a new layer set to multiply and darkening a few shadows. Step 11. In a new layer set to overlay, grab a warm, bright hue for the portion facing the main light source and a cool, blue hue for the portion facing the reflective lighting to form a glowing effect on the fur. Step 12. Grab the Star Ink Splats brush and speckle in some lighting effects in a new layer set to Glow Dodge. Then make them stand out even more by going to Layer Property, Effect, Border Effect, Watercolor Edge. Step 13. With your Gradient G tool on a new layer set to Glow Dodge, pick a warm hue for the top and a cool hue for the bottom to then sweep across your canvas. Step 14. As our final step, we'll wrap things up by using a tonal correction by going to Layer, New Correction Layer, Tonal Correction. This will brighten up your image and amplify the contrast and coloration. Now, we're all done. Long fur is great, but having experience drawing short fur lengths is also useful. For our next step-by-step tutorial, in this guide, we'll be drawing standard rabbit fur. To start things off, let's take a look at our reference images to help us visualize how the fur moves and lays. Step 1. Start with a rough base for your fur in a dark shade. No need to get too detailed. Just block in the general shape. Step 2. Slap on some basic highlights in the regions that are most lit by your main light source. Step 3. Blend in the shades while taking care to still give room for textured strokes. Step 4. In a darker shade of brown, form shadows in the areas that the fur is ruffled. Broad strokes for this step works just fine, as we'll be getting into more extensive detailing next. Step 5. Starting from the bottom and working your way up the shape, use a small brush size to form horizontal rows of fur with downward strokes, alternating between light and dark rows. This will give the appearance of depth. It's important to not just randomly place fur texture, as that can result in a disorderly image that's visually unappealing. Step 6. After the entirety of the base texturing has been applied, now we can go in and darken or brighten any sections of fur that is especially ruffled. Step 7. If your fur is getting too dark or lacking contrast, apply a tone curve by going to Edit, Tonal Correction, Tone Curve to brighten things up. Step 8. With a small brush size and hardness setting of 3 bars, add glossy highlights to the fur regions closest to the main light source. Step 9. On a new layer set to multiply, a gentle coat of shadow is added to the side of the fur facing away from the main light source. Step 10. On a new layer set to soft light, we add a subtle amount of lighting to the sections of the fur with high gloss content, most notably closest to our light source. Step 11. Use a warm color for the portion of the image closest to your light source, and a cool hue for the part facing away from your light source on a new layer set to overlay to add lighting effects. Step 12. As the final touches, we'll go in with our Re-Star Ink Splats brush and speckle in some lighting effects in a new layer set to Glow Dodge. Then, make them stand out even more by going to Layer Property, Effect, Border Effect, Watercolor Edge. All done! Now the moment you've all been waiting for! Shading a character. Putting everything we've learned from the prior segments into application, we'll be shading an anime character in a cel shading style. Let's jump right into this! Step 1. Start with your anime character colored. Then, select the base color layer via Ctrl+ clicking the layer to select the character itself. Or, you can use layer clipping, so that the shading color goes only on the character. Both work. Step 2. I decided to use the number 5 front-facing short hair photo reference to aid me as I shade, so the lighting will be coming from the bottom left corner of my scene. Make a new layer on the multiply blending mode, then shade with the light falls in the reference photo. Exaggerating the lights and darks can help you achieve a more stylistic and anime appearance. Step 3. Grab a new layer set to overlay and place your highlights that are a result of your main light source in a warm color. Step 4. Make a new layer. Then, form a ring in the hair to give it gloss. Blur that ring and set the layer on Glow Dodge. Tip: I have only the hair selected for this step to prevent the color from going outside of this region. Step 5. On a new layer set to multiply, make a ring below your lighting ring to provide depth to the hair. Step 6. With only the character selected, I give a downward sweep from the top of the head with the Gradient G tool on a multiply layer. This is part of the overall hair shading, as my light source is coming from the opposite direction. Step 7. Form strokes of gloss on the hair and eyes to make them pop. Step 8. Make a new layer set to add glow, and with the Gradient G tool, sweep downwards from the bottom left corner to create an apparent light source in your scene. Step 9. On a new layer with the overlay setting, use the Gradient G tool again with only your character selected and add lighting effect by angling the gradient down over the top right corner. Step 10. To make the shading on our character more interesting, lock the layer and select only the neck shading. Then, in a darker color and a different hue, use your Gradient G tool downwards so that the space closest to the chin is darker. Step 11. Make a new layer with the Glow Dodge blending mode below your character layer. With the snow brush, dot in some lighting effects to better visualize your light source. Step 12. For our final step, we'll make our artwork more appealing by implementing a gradient map via Layer, New Correction Layer, Gradient Map, with this newly formed layer on soft light mode. Now, we're good. Gradient maps are a great way for making your art more interesting and applying ambiance to your work. When used in combination with blending modes, you can achieve incredible effects. There's tons of free download options in Clip Studio assets for gradient mapping. Here's a few of my favorites. Light references for humans. Finding the right reference photos or taking your own can be important to helping you grasp how light works in a real-world setting. Let's take a look at some references I've created for the sake of this tutorial with my mannequin model, Joja. I've prepared 3 different hairstyles for her also, to give some diversity and to cover how lighting direction impacts hair as well. Notice how the light and shadows wrap around her facial structure, creating curves and shapes rather than perfect lines. The face's anatomy influenced the shadows and lighting. But let's say you don't want our mannequin Jodra as a reference. You want someone that's real and has ears. Don't worry, I've got that covered too. It's time to bring out our next model and do some lighting studies with her as well. LED models for lighting reference. But let's say you don't have a little town or a Joja to help you with your lighting studies. Don't worry, Clip Studio has your back. A massive variety of 3D models are provided for free. Can't find one you like in the pre-installed options? Check out Clip Studio's assets for 3D buildings, scenes, castles, different body types, and so much more. The 3D models have a built-in lighting function to adjust the light source direction and cast shadow. Wow! That's the end of our tutorial. I'm gonna be so lonely without you. But thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new today. Be sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe for more tutorials. I'll see you next time. Bye!